and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be at the ERF once again and interact with friends and colleagues. Now, I've been given the task to discuss European integration and what may be relevant for the MENA region. There are obviously many differences. I'm not going to dwell on the differences, and one has always to be careful, you know, when one studies one region, what may be useful for others. But what I'm planning to do is to divide my presentations in three parts. First, I want to say a few broad things about regional integration as a process. Then I'm going to discuss a few relevant facts about the European experience, and then see indeed what lessons may be, if at all, relevant for the MENA region. So let me start with this discussion of regional integration as a process. Now that's something I'm taking from you know, Jim and my professor Bella Balassa, who wrote about the theory of economic integration back in 1961. And as you will remember, in the discussion by Balassa, I mean, this is the early 60s, these very early days of integration, with early days of integration in Europe, but also in many other parts of the world. Europe was not the only one. It has been maybe the more successful, although with challenges, process of integration, but there have been others. And I think what I think one needs to remember very much, and I mean, you have spoken about, you know, efforts that are made here in the region. I think what one needs to keep in mind is issues first about sequencing regional integration. I think there are two issues when one talks about sequencing. One is about the degrees of integration. You know, how far are you wishing to go? What kind of integration is this about? What are your objectives? I think that needs to be clear from the start. There should not be too much misunderstanding about what is it you are trying to achieve. But there's also a question of with whom you are doing it. What are the number of countries and what is the economic diversity? So, you know, there's a question of the depth of integration, how far you want to go, but also how wide you want to do this. You want to start with a small group of countries? Should they be very similar? Do you want to go for a very broad integration in terms of countries with lots of diversity? And presumably, as was already mentioned yesterday, there's presumably, at least at some stage, a trade-off between the width and the depth. Probably if you are going for many countries with lots of diversity, that probably comes at the cost of depth, which may be all right. Again, depending on what is it you are trying to achieve. So I don't think there's not a formula. There are many possible formulas, but I think one needs to keep in mind those two dimensions of depth and width and the potential trade-off. Now, you remember that Balassa had put forward this idea, you know, we all have learned as students about 5 stages of integration. Free trade area, customs union, common market, what we call today in Europe single market, economic union, and then full integration. And I think that's good to keep in mind, to have that in the back of our mind, this notion of five stages. But I think it can also be somewhat misleading, in fact. And the reason why I think it can be very misleading, it seems to me one needs to make a crucial distinction between what I would call trade integration and economic integration. And let me make this distinction. You, Chair, have just mentioned about, you know, free trade areas. Free trade areas, as far as I'm concerned, which may be a very useful process, I don't call that economic integration. I call that with a narrower term, which is trade integration. I prefer to use the term economic integration for a deeper version of integration that usually starts, as was the case with the EU, but that's also the case with the Gulf Cooperation Council in the region here, with the customs union. It may take time to do the customs union, but as we will see in a moment, it's much more ambitious. And if you're starting with a customs union, you're probably trying to go further. You're probably trying to go deeper in the process of integration. If you look at free trade areas, they're about trade integration. You can do that very well, but they are not trying to go to the higher stages of integration. So I think, and that's the first point I want to make here, is that there is a key choice to be made at the start of the process integration. Are you wanting to do a free trade area only? Or are you, and therefore only trade integration, or are you really trying to go into deeper integration, what I would call economic integration, of which then the first stage needs to be a customs union? And the choice of that is really mainly political. It depends on what is the objective. I would not say that one is better than the other. Again, what I would insist is, have an objective and try to fulfill that objective, but there may be different objectives. Now, if one looks from a purely economic viewpoint, leaving aside the politics, we as trade economists, we always say, well, there is an advantage of doing a customs union of a free trade area. In a customs union, there are no rules of origin. And Jim has written a lot about rules of origin. Rules of origin, they can be very, very cumbersome, right? In a free trade area, because each country has its own external tariff, in order to prevent trade deflection, you need rules of origin. And rules of origin are administratively cumbersome. And they can even be protectionist. So, you have free trade, but free trade with rules of origin, which is an issue. In a customs union, since all countries have the same external tariff, they have a common external tariff, there is no need for rules of origin. So that's great. But at the same time, precisely because you need this common external tariff, it's hard. And that's why I'm calling a customs union something more than simply a trade integration. It's already economic integration. You have already a higher level of ambition to have a common external tariff, maybe to have a common external trade policy. And that's why we see that when you look in practice, there are very, very few customs union. Customs union, they need much more commitment. They need much more trust, the term that was used yesterday in all the presentations among the participants, than a free trade area. So they're great, but it's a higher level of ambition. It's more difficult. And if you look on regional integration, so integration that involves not just bilateral deals between two countries, but between a group of countries, if you look at those, you don't see many customs unions there. The EU, as I said, is a customs union. It took us 10 years, from 1958 to 1968, to become a customs union, to have a common external tariff. But the GCC is now a customs union. And it took also about 12 years for the GCC, like the EU, to do the integration of the external tariff and to find a way to divide up the revenue. For the rest, almost all of the examples that we discussed and that Jim DeMello yesterday in his presentation made, they were almost all FTAs. ASEAN is a FTA, EFTA is a FTA, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Area, is a FTA. In the region, the PAFTA, the Pan-Arab Free Trade Area, is a FTA, and TPP, which President Trump has sort of canceled, but may come back one day, would have been a FTA. RCEP among the East Asian countries is a FTA. So almost all of the examples there, they are really trade integration. They are not economic integration. They are not trying to go up the ladder in the stages of integration. So I thought that's important to start with. Now, let's look a little bit at the European experience. We are celebrating in a week's time 60 years of the signature of the Treaty of Rome, 1957, that was the launch of the EEC, at the time European Economic Integration, today the European Union. So let's look a little bit at the EU as an example of regional economic integration. I think there are 4 pillars, as far as I'm concerned, of the process, and I insist on this term process, because it's a never-ending process of EU integration. The first pillar was indeed this ambitious initial project, the Treaty of Rome. I think many people, and I agree with that, that probably say that today it would be impossible among the 28 countries that we are to agree on a treaty that was as ambitious as the Treaty of Rome. I'm not even talking of all the treaties that have come after the Treaty of Rome, Maastricht and all those other treaties, but even the Treaty of Rome, which is actually a beautiful document, and if you read it, you see a clear vision, clear objectives, and clear instruments on how to get there. That was really the product of a time. The time was obviously the period immediately after World War II, and it was a project that was obviously both ambitious and built on trust. But the first step of the trust among the 6 countries, as you will remember, was a sectoral arrangement, the Economic Community of Steel and Coal. So it started around a very, very project, which was a narrow but a very ambitious project to put together the steel and coal industry of the countries that had been the belligerent, essentially France and Germany, but then Italy and the 3 Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And that process that was started in 1950 was successful, and then moved to this next step of this ambitious Treaty of Rome signed 60 years ago. So an ambitious initial project, then a gradual elimination of both internal and external barriers, common policies to accompany liberalization. The EC, right from the start, was always more than about trade liberalization. That's why it's not trade integration, it was about economic integration right from the start. And there were a number of policies put in place, whether it's competition policy, the good side, you can discuss common agricultural policy, transport policy. I mean, some of them good, some of them bad, but they all had an element of, in a sense, public good. That was very, very important. There was always some element of redistribution policy, a budget, not a very large budget, but a budget too. And very important common institutions, including the European Commission that was the driving force, and has been the driving force of the process to both drive and manage this process of integration. Again, I want to insist on this term, process of integration. We are 60 years later, we are still not fully integrated. And there are still challenges, and this is 60 years later. And we have all the institutions, we have all the public good, we have all of those elements, and the process is still going on, and, with ups and downs, no doubt. Right from the start, as I said, the ambition of the EU was to go beyond trade integration. We started as a customs union, but as the project said right at the start, the goal was to be a common market and to go beyond that. So there's been a lot of deepening, and we have, after we achieved the customs union in 1968, we launched the single market project in the mid-80s, supposedly achieved by the 1990s, but the reality is that even today, in a number of areas, we still do not have a genuine single market, including in energy, including in digital, including in financial markets. So crucial areas of the single market are still missing today, even though in other areas, let's say trade in goods, we have made huge progress there. We are really an integrated market. We have also a monetary union, and I will say a word in a minute about that. And we have also Schengen, the famous visa-free mobility of labor, and the discussion they've been recently, on which I will come back again. So many areas, and I could cite obviously many others. We have also, as I said, widened. So in a sense, up to a point, Europe was very successful in deepening and widening. We were able to do that. It's the trade-off that I discussed at the start. It's today. But before it looked like we had sort of found the magic wand, being able to do both deepening and widening. And that worked up to a point. But today, I think there are certainly challenges out of that. But it's true, we started 6. And I think one of the great successes of the EU is that we were able to increase to countries that were very different countries. Remember, we had first the enlargement in 1973. That was the UK, Ireland, and Denmark. But then in the 1980s was the southern enlargement. Greece first, then Portugal and Spain, quite poor countries, and then later in the 2000s, the eastern enlargement. So today we are 28. Very soon we are probably going to be 27 with the UK leaving. And again, I will say a word about that. But you know, it's been a huge increase in the number of countries and certainly in terms of heterogeneity. The degree of heterogeneity today compared to what it was at the start is absolutely huge. And I think on the whole we have handled it well, but it certainly poses challenges. Now, I would say the EU has been also, and I think it's a nice way to look at the EU, not just as a process of integration, of liberalization, but also as a laboratory. And it's precisely a laboratory out of this diversity among countries. If you look at the countries inside the EU, all members share important product market policies. We are all part of the single market, and in the single market, the removal of barrier in goods and in services, much more in goods than in services, has been extremely, extremely successful. And there's no doubt that together with some of the common policies, including regional policies, has fostered both structural reforms and convergence of countries. So, I mean, the key element there, I think, have been the single market, free trade, and common regulation inside the EU. The trade policy, we have pursued a liberal trade policy together with the internal liberalization. I think it's very important. We have an external liberalization through the different rounds of GATT and then WTO negotiations. And there's also been a very important role played by competition policy, antitrust, and state aid control. But let's not fool ourselves. The member countries, they retain a significant degree of freedom over some of their policies. And that's the way the process goes, and that's fine. But there's significant differences in areas that are really a matter of structural policy. And if you look at, for instance, the quality of regulation or the quality of governance, you see huge differences of countries across the EU. That explains also the diversity of economic performance, despite the fact that we all share the single market. So convergence, there's been a huge amount of convergence. I'm just looking here at those countries, the 11 Central and Eastern European countries that joined the EU, starting for some in 2004, for some more recently. And what I'm just showing here, I just made this graph. I'm looking at the convergence of those new countries compared to the old countries. The old countries, it's the countries of Western Europe. They are called the EU 15, the 15 countries that were there in 2004 already. And if I look at their GDP per capita measured in purchasing power parity is at 100 for the EU 15, I'm looking here at the 11 countries, and there's no point looking at which country is which, the 11 new member states from the Eastern and Central Europe that joined. If you look in 1992, let's say at the start of changes, political and economic changes in Central and Eastern Europe, on average, those 11 countries, their GDP per capita in purchasing power parity was 40% at that time of the EU 15 countries. By the year 98, when there was the start of the negotiation of accession to those countries in the EU, they were still at the same level, 41% of the EU 15. In 2004, that's when they started, for most of them, 8 of them, to enter into the EU, they had already converged a little bit. They were at, on average, at 49%. So it's the simple average of the 11 countries. They were at 49%. So the pre-accession process was already a process of starting of convergence. And there were already a number of policies put in place to help those countries converge. And then if you look today, let's say here 2015, and despite the crises that have occurred in many of the countries and also in the EU, in the euro area, they are now at 64% of the GDP per capita of the EU 15. So the period that goes from 2004 to 2015 has seen tremendous degree of convergence. And I think that has been really one of the great successes of EU integration. And so it's true that we have become more diverse, that probably today this diversity and this large number is a hindrance to deepening of the process of integration, but there is something very, very successful that was obtained. It's not like it was a waste, in a sense. This process of integration, we managed to take on board new countries with very different economic, socio-political regimes and help them converge through accession to the EU. Nonetheless, as I said, it's clear that there's still a huge degree of differences across countries. And if you look at the difference between GDP per capita across countries, it correlates very, very much with regulatory quality among the EU countries. Now, the EU, we know, has a lot of challenges. I don't have the time to go into the challenges, but we know what are those challenges. And I think the challenges, they do relate very much to the fact that we have gone for deep integration, but very incomplete in some areas, like in the monetary union, like in the migration area, even in the single market, and that has certainly put forward a number of challenges. And, you know, there are some important choices that the European countries will have to make. The heads of states and government are meeting later this week in Rome, whether they will be able to, to give some guidance as to where Europe is going, we shall see. There's obviously all this discussion about Brexit, which is going to occupy the EU for quite a while, and there are some very, very big choices to be made there. Now, if I have 5 more minutes, let me just draw some lessons for the MENA region out of this. I would say first that there are obviously similarities and differences between the EU and MENA, and I will just emphasize one similarity and one difference. One big similarity, I think, is that there is in the region here, and this is what I hear, there is, like in the EU, there is the ambition to go beyond trade integration, to do something more than an FTA, which is fine. But again, you have to see what it entails. But I think there is also a big difference, which is the size. If you look at those are data from UNCTAD. If you look at the intra-area export as a percent of total exports of the area, for the EU, about 60% of the exports of the EU go to the EU itself. If you look at the GCC, which, as I said, is also a customs union, I think a very successful customs union, it's only about 10% of exports of the GCC is going to the GCC. And I think whatever process of integration would take place in the region, it will always be a relatively small proportion of total trade that would be intra-area trade. And that has, I think, all kinds of implication that needs to be kept in mind. So what are the lessons of EU integration for MENA that I want to put forward? First, I think that regional integration in the EU has been highly beneficial for the EU country. EU integration has promoted competitiveness and productivity in the region. As I said before, the EU integration has been a formidable convergence machine, first with the southern countries, later with the countries, and at the moment with the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. But I think one should be aware of going beyond product and capital market integration. Free mobility of labor can be great, but also can be problematic, as we are seeing in the EU. Equally, monetary integration can be great, but can also be problematic. We see, the challenges that we have gone through with the euro. There have been benefits of the euro, but it certainly has raised a number of issues. Anyway, my take is that regional integration is not a long, quiet river. It's certainly long, but not quite. And finally, I would say that regional integration in general does require political commitment and trust among countries. And if you want to go for deep regional integration beyond a customs union, that requires, I think, deep commitment and deep trust among the countries. Thank you very much.